welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners gathered in Washington and expressed solidarity against global threats. President Joe Biden and Yoon Suk-yeol met on the sidelines of the NATO summit and authorized extended deterrence guidelines. Today, we discuss the shared security concerns of European and Indo-Pacific countries.
This is a critical step in maintaining our security.
And they're doing it with the help of China, North Korea, and Iran. We cannot, in my view, we cannot allow the alliance to fall behind.
China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine.
In the studio with me, Mr. Abraham Denmark, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for August until June of this year. Mr. Denmark was Vice President of Programs and Director of Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He also was previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Also joining us, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, South Korea and IP4 leaders were invited to a NATO summit for the third consecutive year. Why does NATO keep on inviting South Korea? What strength does South Korea have as a good partner?
Well, it may have been the 75th anniversary of NATO, but it was the third anniversary after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a real inflection point in international affairs. And since then, these four key Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, have been invited to the NATO summit, and they're contributing diplomacy, they're contributing potentially to the industrial base, including munitions that could go to NATO partners, fighting against Russian aggression, and they're also supporting the cybersecurity and economic security that's so critical globally for these common democratic nations.
Now, Mr. Denmark, the Washington Summit Declaration described China as a decisive enabler in Russia's efforts, in war efforts in Ukraine. For VOA Korean, North Korea is the top news, but for NATO, isn't military powerhouse China's supporting Russia much bigger concern?
Well, it's a much more strategic concern. It's a more geopolitical concern for Europe and for the United States. You see, the United States talks about China as the pacing challenge that we're facing, the only country that has both the intent and the means to alter the international system. So Europe is increasingly seeing China as a global challenger for its ideals, for the international system that it relies upon. That being said, the European partners and allies also see North Korea as a problem, as a challenge, both in terms of its own military capabilities, its nuclear capabilities, but also most immediately for Europe has been its increasing support for Russia in its invasion of Ukraine.
To what degree, though? How much does European countries view North Korea's nuclear and missile development as a tangible threat to them? Do they take North Korea more seriously after North Korea intensified military cooperation with Russia?
I think they see North Korea as a more immediate challenge because of its support for Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. This is the largest land war we've seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands killed and injured. And so North Korea's support for Russia is the immediate proximate challenge that Europe is confronting. That said, though, when you talk with Russian strategists, with Russian policymakers, they do see North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, as a threat to global security, and therefore they see it as a challenge as well.
Dr. Cronin, Washington Summit Declaration described the deepening relations between DPRK and Russia as a source of great concern. Do they view this relationship as a short-term concern of North Korean weapons being used in Ukraine, or a longer-term challenge that Russia is eliciting partners to create a new world order that could undermine U.S.'s strategy?
Well, I think both are a problem. President Yoon called out the indivisibility of this issue the way Prime Minister Kishida of Japan had done so 3 years ago. That is a recognition that war in Europe is a threat to potentially war in Asia. And this growing defense partnership, this rekindling of a Cold War alliance, in effect, between Moscow and Pyongyang is very worrisome for peace on the peninsula, but also for war in Europe continuing, because just as China is this strategic and decisive enabler of the war economy of Russia, with the microelectronics and equipment flowing from China to Russia, Russian military benefits from the munitions of North Korea, and it's a real threat. But yes, the Russia-China relationship potentially could reshape the current rules-based order, and Europeans increasingly recognize that, and they want to help make sharper choices between what Beijing and Moscow have to do, which may mean, China back off providing the equipment that allows Russia to fight this war forever.
Dr. Cronin, on the sidelines of the NATO summit, Presidents Biden and Yoon Suk-yeol met and authorized the guidelines document that outlines the procedures and principles for extended deterrence, a culmination of the nuclear consultative group's work the past year. Now, according to the South Korean Defense Ministry, this is a promise that U.S. nuclear assets will be assigned to Korea during peacetime and wartime. The Korean Defense Ministry also emphasized that this is the first and only non-nuclear state to discuss nuclear operations with the United States. What is the significance?
Well, the significance is that the United States is entrusting our South Korean allies with a lot of important secrets, is what it really means, and processes for how we think about preventing nuclear war. We're doing this because the threat is growing, and we recognize that threat is growing. That's what North Korea is doing with their buildup, and they're trying to decouple the United States guarantees, the nuclear umbrella, if you will, from South Korea's security. And South Koreans are understandably worried about this, and that's what led to the Washington Declaration of April of last year. That's what led to setting up this nuclear consultative group with these 13 work streams, where there's actually a process where the South Koreans are sitting down at the table, often in very classified settings. Abe could say, can't say more about it, but he knows more about this. But the point is, this is bringing a voice and understanding of South Korea into this very important nuclear process without doing the following things: without having independent nuclear capability grow in South Korea, as some South Koreans want, without putting nuclear weapons permanently back on the peninsula as they were before the Cold War ended, and without proliferating generally. So all of these things are protecting both peace and non-proliferation. And I think both the Yoon and Biden administration see that as a really good thing.
Mr. Denmark, you had frequent discussions with Dr. Vipin Narang, who is the appointment for the Nuclear Consultative Group. How do you see the significance? Is it really true that South Korea is the one and only country which really has the strong say in the U.S. nuclear employment?
Well, ultimately, I can't speak to the agreement that was just signed. I believe it's still classified and hasn't been published yet. But obviously, the United States wants to make sure that its South Korean allies are confident in U.S. extended deterrence guarantees. There's been a range of different efforts to reassure South Korea of U.S. commitment, from exercises to dialogues and now these consultative agreements. I think it's as strong as anything we've done with our Asian allies. The only thing that I think is comparable with is how the U.S. engages with NATO itself, which includes several of our nuclear powers. So I think it's a very important development. I think it's a critical mechanism for us to reassure South Korea, but also to send a very clear message to our potential adversaries that this alliance is strong, that they're not going to be able to drive a wedge between us, and that, as they said, that any attack on our allies will be met with an overwhelming response.
So you were still in the government in the lead up to this document of the outlining of the guidelines document. Do you think what has led to this outcome is somehow President Yoon mentioning of a nuclear option and ensuing calls from the public and the political circles to wanting the nuclear weapons? Do you think somehow that moved Washington?
Washington is very aware of the political debates, the discussions happening in Korea, and understands why some are calling for a nuclear capability. But we also understand, and I believe leaders in Korea understand, that pursuing an indigenous nuclear capability would come with tremendous risk and tremendous costs for South Korea. So this is a way for us to enhance deterrence, to strengthen our alliance, but at the same time ensuring that South Korea is still a member of the NPT, is still a member of nuclear nonproliferation more broadly, and is able to be a good, strong ally with the United States to make sure that deterrence remains strong.
Now, Dr. Cronin, some Koreans are still skeptical because there's no really guarantee that U.S. will launch immediate retaliation against North Korea's nuclear attack on South Korea, which cannot be verified in advance. And even with the signing of the Washington Declaration, even with the work of the Nuclear Consultative Group, there are still poll results and the South Korean politicians saying that they will put it as a party platform when they become the leader of the ruling party. How much longer the United States can suppress South Korea's nuclear drive? And doesn't the United States somehow already know that at some point there will be a tipping point in this process?
Well, there might be a tipping point, but I think both allies are working valiantly to prevent that from happening. Saying basically to Pyongyang, no matter what you build, we get stronger. And we're going to work together. And that's the decision. That's what the Washington Declaration and the Nuclear Consultative Group have produced. They've produced an alliance agreement to work together on this common problem on how do we avoid decoupling, how do we deter North Korea, and we both have advantages. And we bring South Korean growing conventional capabilities along with the American nuclear arsenal and American conventional capabilities, along with our diplomacy and economic policies, and we figure out what's the best way to contain the North Korean threat. Now, will this hold up? It won't hold up in the court of public opinion in the sense that there will always be people who are worried because, as the mayor of Seoul said this week, only nukes can stop nukes. There's going to be that idea that unless you have complete autonomy and control over your own destiny, how can I trust, my neighbor, no matter how much I like him? And the point is, there's no 100% guarantee in life, and there will always be that debate. But I think this is what the Yoon administration has found, that there is benefit by working more closely together. We actually get stronger by working together than if we try to work separately. And that could go for adding in Japan and other allies and partners in this equation as well.
Dr. Cronin, NATO leaders in the joint statement said the Indo-Pacific is important for NATO, given that developments in that region directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. We welcome the continued contributions of our Asia-Pacific partners to Euro-Atlantic security. What contributions does NATO want from IP4 countries, and is that in South Korea's interest?
Well, it can be in South Korea's interest, and I think South Korea clearly found a benefit by showcasing its global pivotal state status at NATO summits these last 3 years. That's a real contribution to South Korean clout around the world. And similarly, I think support for what NATO's trying to do against Russian aggression in Europe. President Yoon has made it very clear, especially this week, that that is a threat to South Korean interests, to Asian interests in general, because if Russia's emboldened to invade neighbors, and technology is transferred to Kim Jong-un that maybe embolden Kim Jong-un, that could threaten peace on the peninsula and off the peninsula in Asia. So this is the benefit. The benefit is diplomacy, military security, and industrial security in sort of economic policy. And I'm thinking about cybersecurity. The cyber threats, by the way, are global. So whether you're dealing with Lazarus or Cozy Bear or APT-40, which just to name 3 big groups that are operating out of this axis of upheaval, this axis of resistance, they're hitting Korea, they're hitting Japan, they're hitting Australia, they're hitting Europe, the United States. We face a common problem. So it's very important to use the NATO framework to try to organize a security response to that, to disinformation, but also to help with industrial policy on munitions stockpiling, to deal with things like AI in the future, and to deal with other issues that South Korea is particularly poised to contribute, but also to benefit from, because these are global issues.
But for South Korea, existential threat comes from North Korea and Russia's deepening military ties and possible Russian technology transfer to North Korea. But when you look at the results from the NATO summit, there's no mention how the North Korea-Russia relationship may threaten South Korea. So how can NATO be more helpful in South Korea's security? This summit obviously didn't show any interest in that regard.
Well, NATO did talk about the fact that the arms shipments between North Korea and Russia are a threat, a common threat. So at least they're recognizing diplomatically that that's a global problem. Let's put weight on that. They chose to put more weight on the China issue right now because China is actually really fueling the Russian war economy. That's the real bigger threat. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, from South Korea's perspective, what does this do to prevent Russia from transferring more technology to North Korea, which is a direct threat today to South Korea? And the answer is, well, they're sharing intelligence. They're willing to cooperate and try to help. There are sending countries to the UN command. There are a lot of other ways that they can play a role indirectly. If Russia does cross a red line, then we'll, I think, not only see South Korean munitions go to Ukraine, but I think we'll also see NATO do more to help South Korea's defense.
Can I add something on this? There's an important historical parallel that I think some folks miss. In 1950, or many powers of Europe, Western Europe, the United States, other countries around the Indo-Pacific came to Korea's defense and contributed to defending South Korea from attack from the north. And there's an interesting parallel that now, when the security of Europe is threatened, the United States is looking to South Korea, to other friends and allies, to support peace and stability and support democracy in Europe. So I think there's a broader interest that South Korea has in supporting this because the cause of freedom, the cause of peace, the importance of international borders matters as much to South Korea as it does to any other country in Europe.
So the Korean War may be the only example where many countries allied together to protect the democracy and to protect another country. But now, even European countries are not really proactive in helping with Ukraine. And how could you expect that kind of proactiveness from South Korea?
Well, I think Korea has been helpful so far in terms of supporting U.S. efforts to provide Ukraine with the munitions that it needs, with the diplomatic support. Korea has long punched above its weight in the international system. So I don't think there's talk of sending Korean troops, American troops into Ukraine. That is far beyond what we're talking about here. We're talking about material support. We're talking about diplomatic support. And I think Korea has a critical interest in providing that kind of support to Ukraine because of the interest that I mentioned before.
So you talk about material support. And South Korea has been hinting at possibly providing lethal aid to Ukraine. President Zelensky met with President Yoon many times, and after the Putin-Kim summit, South Korea's national security advisor himself said twice, at least, that South Korea could consider giving lethal weapons to Ukraine. After the NATO summit, do you think now it is more likely that South Korea may provide lethal weapons to Ukraine? Wouldn't that have huge implications?
I think it would have a lot of important implications for them to do it. And I don't have any special insights into what the South Korean government is thinking about this. But I do think that the strategic logic of it is very clear. I think Ukraine needs help. The United States is doing everything that it can to support Ukraine. The European powers are trying to support Ukraine. Other countries, other allies in the Indo-Pacific are trying to support. So I think it's important that the ROK also contribute, but look at it, doing it a way to make sure that it does not undermine South Korea's security. I think there is a very clear way to do that, and look forward to seeing how this issue develops in the coming months.
Dr. Cronin, one of the experts told me that South Korea's indirect ammunitions provision to Ukraine going through other countries didn't impact South Korea's security against North Korea because they were producing new ammunitions to send to Europe. Do you think South Korea should positively consider sending lethal weapons to Ukraine?
Well, South Korea may have other options. So this Star Wars project that was announced here at the NATO summit involves lasers to shoot down drones. That's a real threat, but it's not lethal, right? It's a defensive system. So it may be that South Korea wants to start by sending that kind of system if Russia crosses red lines from Seoul's perspective. But yes, Seoul could still provide more munitions to Ukraine, if not just keeping on providing them to NATO members. And I think, therefore, there are different ways for South Korea to respond to the Russian threat, because it is a common threat, and President Yoon clearly has articulated this indivisibility of the threat, that this is a global problem. It faces South Koreans. They have to do something, but it has to act in South Korean interest, and he is so far.
Dr. Cronin, but there are still some in South Korea that this is still another country's war, and that South Korea getting too deeply involved may have South Korea antagonize China and Russia, which are main stakeholders in the Korean issues. Do you think it is wiser for South Korea to get actively involved in the U.S.-led alliance order, or to leave some room for cooperation and diplomacy with China and Russia?
I guess my response would be, what has Russia just done with Pyongyang? They've rekindled this Cold War alliance. It's a defense pact. They're sharing information. There's special forces from North Korea in Russia right now as we speak and tape the show. Hello, South Korea, wake up. This is a threat to you, not just to Europe. And I think that's a clear and present danger that President Yoon has to grapple with. But yes, of course, you're right. South Korea has to act wisely and smartly in the most intelligent way to not overly antagonize Russia, because Russia could do a lot of harm by transferring hidden technological know-how to North Korea.
Mr. Denmark, among the IP4 is Australia, a member of AUKUS, and you are senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for AUKUS. The Koreans, looking at AUKUS, think they should also get nuclear-powered submarine because North Korea tested nuclear torpedo, and North Korea intends to convert all its existing submarines into attack submarines topped with tactical nuclear weapons. Do you agree with the argument that South Korea should acquire nuclear-powered submarine to effectively counter the North Korean submarine threat? You are honorary rear admiral from the South Korean Navy.
It's true. I actually don't agree that South Korea needs nuclear-powered submarines. I'll explain why. First, what's happening in AUKUS, providing Australia with conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. There are no nuclear weapons involved at all. So it's not a parallel to what North Korea says it wants to do with its submarines. But specifically to South Korea's needs and capabilities, the benefit of nuclear-powered submarines is that they can go long distances and be out at sea for a long time quietly. And for Australia, they need that because the challenges, the threats that they face are quite a distance away. So they need that long reach. Similar for the United States. Korea, on its hand, the threats that Korea faces are much closer. And there is a huge amount of cost associated, work associated with developing, maintaining, using nuclear-powered submarines. So to my estimate, conventionally powered submarines for South Korea are exactly what they need in that you don't need the long distances. They can operate very quietly, and they'd be much more effective and much more cost-effective in terms of confronting the challenges that South Korea is facing and is going to face.
One of the military experts told me that nuclear-powered submarine is really the crown jewel of the American Navy technology. Does it take high level of trust and confidence relationship in order to be able to transfer such technology?
It takes a tremendous amount of trust. It's the United States agreeing to provide that technology to Australia. We've only done it once before, in the early 1950s with the United Kingdom. And so it's something that's very rarely happened. And I think it's something that's not going to happen for any country anytime soon. I don't think that says anything about a lack of trust with Korea. I think it says something more about the unique relationship that the United States has with Australia, the unique requirements that Australia has for a nuclear-powered submarine capability, and the close relations that exist between those three countries. I don't think it should be interpreted as saying that the U.S.-South Korea alliance is somehow less important or less significant, or there's less trust between the United States and South Korea. The trust is phenomenal. As you see with the new nuclear group that's just been established, that level of trust is really strong between the United States and South Korea. They're just very different relationships. They're very different requirements. And that's why you see different handling of the issue.
So South Korea being part of the NPT, there wouldn't be a chance that South Korea can indigenously self-develop its own nuclear-powered submarines?
It could. The NPT does allow for the development of nuclear power. It would be very expensive for decades, generations of high expense, for what I would say is a very limited military benefit. But there is a carve-out in the NPT for naval nuclear propulsion, which is how the United States and the UK have been able to do this, and now Australia has been able to do this as well.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Cronin, Mr. Denmark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.